Hi guys, welcome to this tutorial on Christmas Carol. Believe it or not, this is now the 5th time I've had to restart this. So if you hear at some point some banging music in the background, I'm really sorry, but there's not much I can do about it. So anyway, I will just persevere. So what I wanted to do in this video is to think about a potential question. This is not a previous exam question, but I think this focus on children is quite interesting and it could easily be a question on a paper. So that's why I've kind of selected this. There's lots of, if you have a look at my other sort of tutorials, you'll see there are plenty of Christmas Carol questions from previous papers, but this is one that doesn't actually sort of exist as of yet. So I'm focusing on this idea of children. I think they're an interesting sort of, they have an interesting function in a Christmas Carol. They work in some ways to sort of, as the antithesis to Scrooge and his sort of miserly ways. They represent hope and optimism and generosity of spirit. Even in their sort of child forms. So having a look at this extract I've chosen, this is from stave 2 or chapter 2, and focuses on the ghost showing Scrooge as his former self. So I've highlighted a few key elements from this. Have a read through and just have a look at the elements I've highlighted there. So one of the first things I wanted to think about was that description of Scrooge as a child, as a solitary child. That adjective solitary, clearly reminding us of solitary as an oyster from chapter 1. But then this verb choice of neglected really has that sense of abandonment. It reminds us of Dickens's own childhood, the kind of abandonment he felt from his father after his dad got out of the debtor's prison, but sort of left his son for a number of months before kind of reintegrating him back to the family. And then Scrooge's response to seeing that child self, the verb sobbed, is really quite significant. Then looking through the rest of this extract, we see actually not particularly a presentation of children, but a presentation of the conditions that this child was in at his school. And I've chosen a number of the kind of bleak images of the coldness, the dreariness, the chilliness of it. And that idea of warmth and light as generosity and love, and the opposite being true, the coldness, the darkness, reflecting the kind of miserliness or the joylessness that Scrooge has in later life. So it could sort of trip you up a bit, something like this, because you think, well, there aren't any children, but I think it's provoking you to consider the experience of children, how their lives were, and to think about, the experience of many Victorian children who had these deprived conditions. And then sort of zooming in a sense, on Scrooge, the child Scrooge, in the melancholy room. I think this mirrors nicely chapter 1, where Scrooge elects to sit having a melancholy meal on Christmas Eve by himself. But then we get these images of him as the lonely boy reading by the feeble fire. And as I mentioned, fire, it's a recurring motif in A Christmas Carol, really symbolic of warmth and generosity, or the opposite being true in this sort of feeble state, a bit like with Bob Cratchit in chapter 1, representing that kind of lack of generosity and warmth. And again, this another verb here used to sort of show Scrooge's reaction, which is that he wept, really evoking a lot of sympathy. One of the things I find interesting to talk about in this is the idea of the solitary child. Now, in chapter 1, he's solitary as an oyster, but that's very much a self-imposed solitude, whereas here as a child, it's the idea of neglected, abandoned, and therefore we do feel sorry for the young Scrooge. Okay, so then thinking about the rest of the novel, I always use just a quick planning structure like this to sort of think about the things that I would like to discuss. So in terms of the beginning, which I'm sort of arbitrarily putting as 1 and 2, and then 3, 4 and 5 at the end, we obviously have the extract that we can mention. But is there evidence of children in another way? Well, there is, isn't there? There's the kind of carol singing child who comes to see Scrooge in chapter 1, and the Scrooge ultimately sort of threatens. So this child brings joy, brings love, brings light on Christmas Eve to Scrooge's office, and Scrooge ultimately threatens him and rejects that kind of Christmas festive spirit. So I definitely would talk about that. The other thing that I might mention are the references in chapter 2 to Bell's children. And we know that for Scrooge, seeing this child, seeing the child he could have had, is something that really is devastating to him. It represents what he could have had if he hadn't prioritised greed and prioritised money, the golden idol as Bell calls it. And at that point it has a really strong response in that he tries to extinguish the ghost. He tries to extinguish the light from the ghost, the truth of what he could have had. So Scrooge has a very strong response to these children and is clearly quite devastated in many ways. So I would certainly talk about those. Now, if I was moving on to think about the middle of the text, I think about chapter 3. I think very closely about Scrooge's interest in Tiny Tim and his concern about his survival. You know, he asks the ghost, will Tiny Tim live? And obviously he gets the quite bleak information that the ghost sees a vacant stool next year. So we get that sense, don't we, that children without access to basics and healthcare in the case of someone like Tiny Tim who's got an unspecified disability, that it was highly likely child mortality rates were quite high for young Victorian children like that. So clearly Dickens making quite a strong point there. So I might well talk about Tiny Tim and that concern. I might also think about ignorance and want. I think they are really quite important characters, and they come right at the end of chapter 3. And they are described as being kind of wolfish, which I always think is a really interesting quote, because they sound, even though they're children, as being quite predatory and animalistic. And in many ways that's supported, isn't it, by the idea of the claw. Scrooge asks, is it a foot, is it a claw coming out from under the robe of the ghost? I think we can do quite a lot here about Dickens's message around the cycle of crime and poverty that these children are sort of born into and exist in. And really we get that sort of, a bit where the ghost is sort of repeating Scrooge's words to him and sort of saying, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And really Scrooge having to face up to that idea of his own responsibility. So that's the kind of elements I talk about in the midsections. When it comes to chapter 4 and 5, I think we've really got, again, the Tiny Tim focus of Tiny Tim's death. And in many ways, the family's sort of grief, but acceptance about that, because Tim, even though he was a child, and a beloved child, lived a full life even though it was young. He was young and didn't live for many years, but in fact he left, the way I think about Tim is that he left a legacy, one of positivity and love and kindness, and he thought about others even at the end of his life. So unlike Scrooge, when Scrooge sees himself in chapter 5, he's very aware that nobody grieves him. Sorry, in chapter 4, he's very aware that nobody is grieving him, and his life has had no positive impact on anybody. So I think there's an interesting point to be made around the juxtaposition of Tim's death and Scrooge's death. And then finally, I think when we come to chapter 5, we can make the point about Scrooge becoming a second father, because Tiny Tim did live. He did live. And, and obviously Tim's famous kind of God bless us all quote at the end, again, that sort of positivity. So the idea that children represent the best of us in many ways, the positivity, the love, the optimism, they represent the future, they represent hope, the reality in Victorian England. There was too many poor, too many children that were struggling. So these are really sort of the areas that I would be focusing on. And then, as you will have seen in other videos, you know, it's a case then of kind of patching together these plans and these ideas, and sort of building your argument. I would always try this idea of a thesis statement. So try, if you can, at the start of your essay to answer that in one sort of sentence or statement, which might be, you know, presents children as an optimistic and generous, positive influence for good. And then you can kind of go on. Okay, so I hope me kind of planning and talking you through this has been useful. Thanks for watching.